The following Truth Barista podcast is a High Beam Ministry production. This is Maurice. I am the host at the Erzatz Coffee Shop, and you are listening to the Truth Barista podcast.
Now, when Jesus was here on the earth, Jesus was both king and priest. He could have the vision and he could get the provision. The Old Testament priests were responsible for, number one, hearing God. They had to hear God. God talked through the priest. Now, the kings were the ones that went to battle and destroyed the enemies of God.
Welcome to the Erzatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Truth Barista. Oh, we've got some road work out here today. I don't know what all that
terrible
noise is, but I guess it's a part of the community getting ready to reopen.
It's urban music. That's what it is.
Music. But we're going to continue in this wonderful series that you've been talking about, where the priests and where the kings came from. I'm just excited.
Okay, yes. We talked about the firstborn last week, so you have all those notes and you have your Bible.
Yep.
Okay, before I get going, do you remember the show, The A-Team? I mean, you're old enough to remember that old show.
I love it. Well, The A-Team, there were two movies.
Yep.
Two, and I love them both. And you know something? When they come on TV, I watch them again.
Yep, and I love that theme song. And the best part of that were all the crazy characters. Of course, Mr. T.
Pay the fool.
The leader was George Peppard, who played John Hannibal Smith. Okay, and he had a line he used in every single show, and it was this one.
I love it when a plan comes together.
Well, that's the kind of the course I want to take on the Bible study here, because I love seeing how things come together in the Bible. And if you get a big view of the Bible, you see things in Genesis that get pulled together in Revelation, and then at various spots along the way. So I want to take you on one of those trips.
Oh, I can't wait.
Okay.
I love when a plan comes together.
Okay, so here we go. We talked last week on Firstborn and how the patriarch basically rules the family. He's the focus on the family in ancient Israel. It's all about him. It's patriarchal, whether you like it or not.
You know, and I think we should have a shameless plug here, because I think people need to go back and hear that series again. It kind of sets the pace to where even we're going today.
You have to understand how essential the firstborn was in ancient Israel to understand what Jesus is doing.
It's one of the best series I think you've done. It was so insightful.
Why, thank you. Thank you. So the patriarch
You want to get a raise?
Yeah, I've got some dishes back there you could do. Let's start with that. Okay, so the firstborn of the family is actually the patriarch in training. So the father functioned in two ways in ancient Israel. He functioned as a priest, and he functioned as a king, albeit in a very limited kingdom, right? His family, an extended family. But his word was law, and he was a priest. Now, you had a question about priests. What was that?
We think of priests today kind of like in the Catholic Church, but it goes beyond that. I mean, what is the true meaning of a priest?
In a biblical sense, a priest is a person who stands between God and the people. Specifically regarding the patriarch, the father, he stands between God and his family. He represents God to his family, and he represents his family to God. So, for example, if he's representing God, when God tells him to do something, he says that to the family. This is the direction we're going. You see that in Noah. God talks to Noah and says, build an ark. What does he say to his family? We're building an ark. God says to Jacob, you need to go up to this area and do do this and such. And what does Jacob say? Family, pack up, we're moving.
Well, and in the early days, the priest and the king were just one person, right? So they had all the authority in one kind of container.
That was the patriarch.
Right.
So he served as this priest, as kind of like the go-between God and the family. And he also served as the king, so to speak, as the ruler of the family. His word was law within that family. So this is where we get the general idea of an official priest as an intermediary and an official king who leads a family called a nation or a kingdom, and his word is law. That's really generally talking. So let's talk about this father as priest. You do see this all over the Bible a lot.
Well, it starts with Adam, right?
Well, it does, but I want to go one generation or a couple of generations later to Noah.
Okay.
Let's start there.
Okay,
because when Noah gets the word from God, they go through the flood. When they get out of the ark, the first thing he does is he builds an altar. That's a priest thing to do, right? And then you get to Abraham. He made altars all over the place. Genesis 12, Genesis 13, Genesis 22. His son Isaac, when he becomes the patriarch of the family, also builds an altar. And Patriarch Jacob built an altar after him in Genesis 33.
Okay, but I have a question.
Yes.
You know, we know what an altar is today, right? Because we've been around altars. They've been around for generations. However, how did Noah know what an altar was? I mean, how did he just say, I'm going to build an altar?
Well, an altar back in those days is simply a raised platform or a space where you would place a sacrifice. It's a set-apart place saying, this is your table, God, and upon God's table we will offer the sacrifice to him. And in many pagan religions, it's the food of the gods, etc. But it's the place where sacrifice is made. And so this was quite common in ancient Middle East and around the world, actually.
So it was kind of what was part of the customs of the day.
Right.
Except they were focusing on Jehovah God rather than just on any God.
And even in our day, many churches have an altar. It's a central point that's right in the middle of this church sanctuary or the middle of the front of the church sanctuary. It's the focal point where the priest or the pastor interacts with God and God interacts with the people. So same idea. We just don't do bloody sacrifices on the altar, thank God. Okay, so getting back. You thought that was funny, huh? I tell you, sometimes you really want to, but no, anyway. So getting back to this, the father served as the family priest, and because the firstborn was to step in line when the father steps aside, the firstborn son becomes the priest of the family. Now, you mentioned Adam. I'm going to blow your mind right now. Here we go.
Oh, good.
Okay, Adam was God's firstborn son, and he was also God's king over the world, and he was also God's priest between the world and God. And I will show that to you right now. His job in Genesis 2 was to work the garden and watch over it. Now, that word to work the garden and watch over it are great Hebrew words, avad and shamar. That means to work and to keep. In other words, to cultivate and to protect. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I just came across this great book by Gregory Beale. He's a great writer, and he says that these two words are used regarding, in a variety of ways, in other words, about Israelites serving God and guarding or keeping God's word. But it is also specifically used of the priesthood guarding the temple or serving the temple, that's avad, and guarding it from being defiled by evil. So when you take those words and you apply them to Adam, Adam is serving as a priest within a sacred space or a temple, in air quotes, called Eden, where he is keeping it. He's serving God by keeping it up, and he is tasked with keeping evil out.
That's a different element of a priest, because we always think, as you say, it's the intermediary. It's the speaking of what God says to the priest passes it on. But it's also protective. He is in a position to keep things going the direction that God wants them.
Let's translate it to today. Your average pastor, what is their basic job description?
Well, I think is to preach the truth and to keep the truth biblical.
But in doing so, what are they doing? They are nurturing and cultivating the field, the area that God has given him, called the congregation, and his job is to guard it from sin and evil. Preaching the word sets up those parameters saying, this is evil, don't go there, don't let evil into your life. Now, the sad part to say is that didn't exactly work because they allowed the snake, the serpent, he was there in the garden. What is Satan? What is the snake doing in the garden? Well, Well, it's okay until he starts tempting Eve, and that's when evil gets in. They would have performed their priestly task if they had ignored him.
And you know what I just learned the other day?
What?
That evil started with a lie.
Yeah?
I mean, it's based on lies.
Oh, there's all sorts of evil in that situation. In fact, let's do a study on that sometime, is what was the nature of the fall? Why did Eve give in? Why did Adam give in? What did it appeal to them? Okay? But as priests, they were to keep this evil influence out to guard the garden from evil. Okay, so that's Genesis 2. So God talks to Adam. You see, you can't take this Genesis 1 to Genesis 2. You have to go by order of how God made Adam and Eve. So you start with Genesis 2, where God says to Adam, and he's all alone, you are to guard and keep the garden. You are a priest. You are to cultivate it and keep evil out of it. Then he goes, got to build a woman for this guy here to help him out, a teammate, which is what the Hebrew there means. She's his perfect counterpart. They are perfectly suited, perfectly balanced, working side by side. So he's a priest. By virtue of her coming from him, she is also sharing in this priestly function. Okay, now you go to Genesis 1 and you get them being created again, where God says, I'm going to make me humanity. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to let them rule and reign over the earth in my place. I'm the king, but they'll be my vice regents. And they'll be my firstborns who are going to rule and reign over my creation. So in Genesis 1, that's what he does. So by the time you get to Genesis 3, what do you have? You have God's firstborn, Adam, and his perfect counterpart as a king and a priest unto God. That's the original pattern. It's all right there. So moving from that point forward, Noah, he's a king and a priest. Abraham functions as a leader, king, and a priest. Isaac, Jacob, everything is perfectly lined up. But then all of a sudden, some interesting things begin to happen. Now, you know the story of the Exodus, right?
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Moses comes and tells Pharaoh, let my firstborn son Israel go.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you let him go out so that they can worship. 50 days, they make it to Sinai. On the 50th day, God says, you're my firstborn son. Now you're going to be my nation as well. I'll be your king, and all of your firstborns represent each of the families, tribes, etc. Okay, just like it was before. Okay, so now you've got this wonderful covenant that was made at Sinai, and something really bad happens.
They ran out of coffee.
Yes, they did. And seeing as I need some coffee, I don't want something bad to happen, so you could go fetch that for me?
That sweet aroma, bold and beautiful, I can hardly wait to taste. Early morning, something wonderful is about to make my day. Hey, give me a good cup of coffee, give me a word that rocks me, a whole lot of Jesus and a little caffeine. You and my awakening, the world that waits out the front door, let it wait just a bit more, 'cause I need Jesus and a little caffeine. You and my awakening.
Truth Barista, we're living in such turbulent times with this coronavirus. What advice would you have for our audience?
Well, the first thing, you have to not give in to fear, right? I mean, you listened to a recent Dennis Prager.
Yes, and he was saying some wonderful things. Don't waste this time, but contact your friends by phone or by Skype and talk to them and your family. Do things that you haven't done for years. Do things together as a family in your own home, but do something productive and don't sit and mope and get depressed by what you hear on the news.
So on the negative side, don't give in to fear, right? That means we have to limit our consumption of the news, consumption of social media. Now, we don't want to be uninformed. We want to be informed, but man, talk about Debbie Downers, and stay away from the people who are being uber sensational about this and just stoking the fires. We don't need this. It is what it is, okay? It's like a pandemic, like a flu-type pandemic, although it has different characteristics characteristics. But, and this is the point I'd like to make too, is admittedly and apparently this has a high infection rate. So if we lower the possibility of infection, we'll have a lower potential for spread, and that will lower the severe number of cases and even deaths, and lower the strain on the hospitals so that they can keep pace and give proper care for those who need it. So really the positive thing is this is a great opportunity, like you said, to stay at home, stay in the neighborhood. I've seen a lot of people walking their dogs, hanging out with their kids, gardening already, doing some fantastic things. And you know what's the most important thing for us? You gotta stay in the coffee and you gotta stay in the Word.
What a great combination. Thanks for that encouragement, Truth Barista.
And don't forget to listen to the past episodes of The Truth Barista.
Great thought. Okay, obviously, Truth Barista, they didn't run out of coffee. I just said that because
you were thirsty and looking for an excuse. That's what it was.
I wanted a fresh cup of coffee.
Okay, what really bad thing happened at Mount Sinai?
Well, they did this calf, this golden calf they began to worship.
Right. Now, the people doing it happen to be the leaders of the families, and as the leader goes, so goes the family. And so now Israel's getting out of control, having this great big weird worship party in front of this Egyptian god like calf, and Moses comes down, breaks the tablets, and he says, you know, anybody who's for the Lord and for me, you pull your swords and you're going to have to just stop them physically. And guess who steps forward? Moses' family, the Levites. So they exercise God's control over the people, and God goes, okay, this is what I'm going to make a choice, and I'm going to make a change. Instead of the firstborns being priests, because obviously they can't handle the position because they led the people astray.
Too much responsibility being king and priest.
But it's great to be the king. No, just kidding. Anyway, they can't handle that responsibility. So God says, I'm choosing the Levite that proved that they will take the responsibility to help control the people and represent the people to me. So now the priesthood passes from the firstborn of Israel to the Levites, and there you go. That's where the Levite priesthood came from, with Aaron being the major high priest. Do you see?
I do. That makes sense.
Okay, now the question is, what happened to the kingship? Because if all of the firstborns were supposed to be the kings, does that mean there are a lot of kings running around in the tribes and the families? I mean, isn't that going to be a big mess? Everybody making their own law. There needs to be some sort of a national cohesion, make it one big nation. So if you've got a nation of these individual families, clans, and tribes, you need one king over them. Now, I'm going to back you up from Sinai, and we're going to go back into the late part of Genesis 49. Jacob brings Joseph, his designated firstborn, because Reuben sinned, and you have to go back to the previous series. He looks at Joseph and says, I'm going to bless your kids because you're the firstborn. The firstborn gets the birthright, so he gets the blessing. But then after that, Jacob does something really, really weird. He says, by prophecy, he says this in Genesis 49, the scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. If Joseph were to be the king, it would have said, the scepter will not depart from Joseph, or the two tribes, his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, that kind of moved up into his place. It would have said that, but it said, no, it's going to go to Judah. Why? God is going to make another choice and another change. Why? Because he's God. It's good to be the king, right? So that doesn't happen right away. We get to the point in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Samuel actually, where Israel says, okay, we're a big bunch of people and we all want to be held together. That means we want a king like all the other nations around us. So God, give us a king. And he goes, okay, I'll get you a king. So he gives them a king that would appeal to them. That's Saul. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. They selected Saul. They were impressed by Saul because he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a guy they could really look up to. Oh, that was good. I cracked me up.
Oh, my.
Okay, so anyway, let me ask you a question. He's of the tribe of Benjamin, but Jacob said the king is going to come from what tribe again?
Well, Judah.
Okay, so obviously, is this God's choice or is more along the lines of what people would want?
Wow, it's God's choice.
But let me show you this.
Oh, boy.
Saul sins. And like the sin of the golden calf, which caused God used to change to the Levites, so God says, aha, Saul's not going to do it. I'm going to pick a man of my own choosing, and that's going to be not the firstborn of Jesse's family. I'm going to pick the 8th kid, and I'm going to treat him as a firstborn, and I'm going to choose him to be king, and that was David.
Isn't that something? But you also told us in numerology, I just want to bring that back out, that he was the 8th child. What does 8 mean?
Well, 8 is a fascinating number because a whole week is done 1 through 7, right? With the Sabbath being the 7th day, and that's the completion of the week. So it starts over with the number 1. Well, 7 plus 1 is 8, and biblically, 8 is looked upon as a number of new beginning. So in a sense, with Saul's sin being of the tribe of Benjamin, God uses it to make a new beginning and switches now to fulfill his prophecy to Jacob through Jacob, and now the kingship shifts to Judah through David. Now, what? What are you going to say?
I think it's just fascinating how you all tied that together.
Okay, so this gets really, really cool because at this point, you still have the firstborns of the family who have the responsibility. They do represent God to their families and their families to God. You have all of that. But now, officially among the nation, you have the firstborn tribes, which is Joseph and his subsequent Ephraim and Manasseh. You have Joseph with the double portion tribes. That's firstborn. You have the kingship sitting in Judah, and you have the priesthood sitting in Levi. It's all split up. It's not the way it was supposed to be. But God is about to make another change, and that change comes through his firstborn son, Jesus. And according to what we see in the New Testament, Jesus then takes on the role of the king and the high priest. And it all comes back together with him. Are you ready for a little exploration?
All right. I love that. I love the way it all comes together in Jesus. And that's the way the plan was, right?
I love it when a plan comes together.
Oh, the A-team. I love it. Okay. Israel is God's A-team, by the way. Just saying. Okay. So Jesus is unique. He is a firstborn. Like the nation of Israel, he was born of a woman through the power of God. Let me explain. Mary was his mother. God was his father. So there you have a human mother and the power of God. Israel was born of Sarah, but it was only through the power of God that enabled a woman who had already gone through menopause to be able to bear children again. So Jesus and Israel are very parallel to each other. They are both firstborns, born of a similar manner. So in Jesus, the firstborn status and the kingship are united. Listen to what the angel Gabriel says to Mary. It says, now listen, you will conceive, and by the way, this happens to be Luke chapter 1, 31 through 33. Now listen, you, Mary, will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord will give him the throne of his father David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. In Luke 2, it says, then she gave birth to her firstborn son. So now you have a firstborn son to whom is promised the kingship of Israel, and he's of the line of Judah. So it's all coming back together in him. You have a firstborn who's taking on or been promised the kingship.
I love it when a plan comes together.
And when Jesus steps up at his baptism, his Father's voice comes down and he says, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased, Matthew 3:17. But that's the kingly announcement formula from Psalm 2, verse 7. I will declare the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. What's interesting about this is when a greater king conquers a lesser king and they strike up an agreement, they will say, I am your father, the greater king, says to his servant king, you are my son. In other words, your loyalty belongs to me as if you're just part of my family. Okay, so what God is doing there is not just saying Jesus is his son. He's saying, Israel, this is your king, by calling him a son. You follow that one?
I think that's appropriate, though, right? I mean, because it's all a part of the plan.
Now, what's cool is because Jesus can no longer die, he will forever be Israel's last and final everlasting king. So in Jesus, the kingship is firmly embedded and will never be separated.
Well, isn't that the promise to King David, that there'll always be someone on his throne?
Exactly. Now, I'm going to jump fast into this. Jesus is not only the firstborn, he is also the high priest. When Israel sinned with the golden calf, the priesthood was taken from Israel's firstborn and given to the Levites, who proved faithful. Now, at the time of Jesus' death, there was a high priest named Caiaphas. He was of the Sadducees, and he's in a family line called the Zadokites, meaning the righteous ones. And so he's serving. The problem is it wasn't very righteous, and he wasn't a legitimate high priest, because the Torah says a high priest can only succeed a family member high priest, and that family member high priest has to die first before the next high priest takes office. Well, the Romans appointed high priest, so that broke the one, and his father-in-law Annas, a previous high priest, was still alive. Breaks number 2. So here you have an illegitimate high priest not ruling according to God's law. So at Jesus' trial, Caiaphas is looking at Jesus, and Jesus is confronting Caiaphas, and Jesus makes a statement saying, yep, I am the king of Israel, and I'm also going to be the one who's going to judge your tuchus when I return. And Caiaphas tears his robe, which breaks another Torah law that says you can't tear the band on the high priest's garment. So he's disqualified 3 ways. So where is Israel going to find a high priest? They have to find a high priest who qualifies in the area of God's choice, sinlessness, being set apart, someone who is compassionate.
Specifically, that the high priest had to have 2 essential functions or qualifications. First of all, he had to be full of compassion, and secondly, he had to be called by God.
And really, in front of Caiaphas, the illegitimate, disqualified high priest, stands a man of God's choosing who is the most qualified and singularly qualified to serve as Israel's high priest. And so God, according to the scriptures, has selected his son to be the high priest. So if you read the book of Hebrews, it's all about Jesus being God's high priest. And since he died and rose again, he will forever be the high priest. Nobody's going to replace him. So in Jesus, both the king and the high priest are embedded back into the firstborn, and he will always be Israel's king and high priest.
And that, my friend, is really the end of that story, right?
No, there's something more, because Jesus does something that's impressive here. The Torah says that the office of the king and the priest should be separate, and it's a very fascinating division of powers. In fact, you have a king named Uzziah who wanted to function as a priest. So he grabs the incense altar and he runs into the temple like the priests want to, and the priests are getting around, no, you can't be here, get out of here before something bad happens to you. And what does God do? Bam, hits him with leprosy in the forehead. What's fascinating is leprosy disqualifies a person from coming close to God. So God is going, oh, you want to do this the wrong way? Then I'll make sure you never come here again. That was God's saying, no, the king cannot serve as a priest. The priest cannot serve as a king. But if you go to Zechariah, here is a very fascinating verse. Ready? This is Zechariah chapter 6, 9 through 13. The word of the Lord came to me, and this is after Israel returned from the Babylonian captivity. Take an offering from the exiles from Heldai, Tobiah, and Yediah, who have arrived from Babylon, and go that same day to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah. Here we go. Take silver and gold, make a crown, and place it on the head of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. A crown on the head of a priest? Anybody who knew the Torah, their ears would perk up. Verse 12, you are to tell him, this is what the Lord of armies says. Here is a man whose name is Branch, which is a messianic reference. It's a messianic title. So God is saying, here is a picture of the Messiah to come. He will branch out from his place and will build the Lord's temple. Yes, he will build the Lord's temple. It's almost like people are going at the end of 12. What? Verse 13, yes, he will build the Lord's temple. He will bear royal splendor and will sit on his throne and rule. There will be a priest on his throne, and there will be peaceful counsel between the two, which basically means there is coming a Messiah, and in that Messiah, both the priesthood and the kingship will be bound together. And now you have firstborn Yeshua, who is both the king and the priest, just as Adam was. He is the second Adam who pulls it all together.
And that's what the Apostle Paul said, right? It's the second Adam.
Exactly. In other words, we're on the A team. Now, to kind of pull this together here, this name, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, is Yeshua, son of the righteous Jehovah. That's what it means. So literally, Jesus' name and identifier as his firstborn son is linked with king and priest in this verse. Now, by the way, a lot of people say, oh, that was really a cool intellectual experience. What does that have to do with us? Everything. Because, amazing Larry, God says we have been adopted into the family, which means our firstborn elder brother Yeshua regards us as brothers and sisters, and we share in his inheritance. And if he is both the king and priest, it now explains why we are called a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
Wow, right out of Peter.
So what started in Genesis ends up in Peter and in Revelation, because in Revelation it also calls them a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. As part of Jesus' A-team, so to speak, we are co-regents with him. We are co-priests. We don't need a mediator. We have one, it's Jesus, but because God lives in us, that dividing wall of a priesthood is we can all have direct contact with God, and God can have direct contact with us. And you know what I got to say about that?
I love it when a plan comes together.
Whoa, mind blown. This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast.